Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Today, I am very pleased to present to the House the fiscal year 2016 Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill with my colleague, Mr. Chaka Fattah of Pennsylvania. We've worked very closely.
Committee will be in order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Texas. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking my ranking member, Chaka Fattah of Pennsylvania. It's been a pleasure to work with him. We have worked together closely on this legislation. I appreciate Mr. Fattah's approach to the bill. His input has improved the bill considerably, and I look forward to working with him and all the members of the subcommittee as we move forward and go into conference with the Senate on this important legislation. I also want to thank Chairman Hal Rogers of Kentucky and our ranking member Nita Lowey of New York for their help in putting this legislation together. This is my first year chairing the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee. It's an extraordinarily important committee that oversees so many noble and worthwhile efforts that the federal government is engaged in, both in protecting lives and property of the American people, in advancing scientific research and space exploration. And I am especially grateful to Chairman Hal Rogers for his trust in me in this extraordinarily important assignment. I want to thank him also for his generous allocation to this subcommittee as the Congress, under the Republican leadership, has done our very best to live within our means, as every American must do. Every business, every private citizen knows how important it is to only spend the money that you have in hand. Don't spend more than you've got, and we have, in this Republican Congress, done our very best through the appropriations process to live within our means. And our subcommittee has, with that in mind, I'm a personal follower of Dave Ramsey's advice. I do so in my personal life and try to do so in representing the people of West Houston. Don't spend more money than you've got, and the money you've got you want to prioritize. And we have in this subcommittee prioritized the many agencies that we have responsibility for. In priority order, we've approached it with law enforcement number one, made sure that the FBI have got the resources they need to do their job of protecting this nation against terrorists and espionage, cyber espionage. They're a growing problem that we see in so many ways. The enemies of the United States have figured out how to hardwire Trojan horses and backdoors into telecommunications equipment, and the FBI has just done a spectacular job of protecting this nation in the area of cyber espionage and terrorism, and we've made the FBI a top priority in this legislation and made sure that they've got all the money that they need to do their job. We've also prioritized the work the Department of Justice is doing in enforcing our laws. We've made sure that scientific research, space exploration is prioritized, and America will preserve its leadership in the world in space exploration. We've made sure that weather forecasting is funded and taken care of. Managing the nation's fisheries are extraordinarily important. And as you work down that list of priorities, we've made sure those at the top of the list are fully funded, and those that tend to fall towards the bottom, we've just simply had to drop some programs that are no longer authorized. The length of time for which Congress approved them has expired, or they weren't fulfilling the function for which they were originally intended. But we, in the bill before us today, Mr. Chairman, have provided $51.4 billion in funding for this year, which is a $1.3 billion increase over last year, but $661 million below the President's request. The President's budget assumed a number of tax increases and fee increases that are simply not going to happen. So we, again, wanted to live within our means and do our very best to minimize the debt that we're passing on to our children and grandchildren. So we have done our best in this environment to fund the priority programs while reducing funding for activities that are not essential to the operations of the federal government. Once we have taken care of the FBI and made sure they've got the funding they need to protect this nation in an era of evolving threats, we've also included funding, Mr. Chairman, for 55 new immigration judges. Our committee has jurisdiction over these executive branch judges that handle immigration cases, and because of the tremendous backlog of immigration cases, we have added 55 new immigration judges to reduce that backlog and made sure at the same time that we're providing, we're fully funding the U.S. Attorney's offices, the Marshals Service, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and our prison system. Now, for state and local law enforcement, Mr. Chairman, the subcommittee has increased funding for priority programs such as the Burn Formula Program, State Criminal Alien Assistance Program funding, which compensates state and local taxpayers for the cost of housing people who are in the country illegally and have committed criminal acts in violation of state law and are housed in state prison facilities. That's the responsibility of the federal government, and we've funded that program to the highest extent that we can. We've also funded youth mentoring programs, which do such great work. We've made we've created, in addition, Mr. Chairman, in this bill, a $53 million community trust program that will fund police body cameras, body camera demonstration programs, and justice reinvestment initiatives. And I want to special thanks to our Texas State Senator Royce West, who in the just concluded Texas legislative session, Texas became the first state in the union to pass legislation controlling when, where, and how body camera data can be provided to law enforcement or in a criminal trial to make sure to protect the privacy rights of individuals. And we respect that. In our legislation, we make sure that state law controls when, where, and how police body camera data will be used. We've also made sure, Mr. Chairman, that NASA is fully funded in this legislation. We provided an $18.5 billion funding level this year for NASA, which is a $519 million increase and is equal to the request we received from the President. We've made sure to preserve America's leadership role in manned space exploration, planetary science, and made sure that we are also continuing to advance aeronautics research that NASA does such an extraordinarily important job in. We funded the continued development of the Orion crew vehicle at the level asked for by the White House, and increased resources for the Space Launch System to speed up when we will use that important launch system to get Americans back into orbit. We have made sure that the National Science Foundation is fully funded. We increased the funding level for the National Science Foundation by $50 million above the historically high level they had in last year's bill. We also included full funding for the very important BRAIN initiative, which Ranking Member Fatah has championed over the years, which promises to unlock the secrets of the single most important organ in the human body and promises great things for the future. Mr. Chairman, we've also funded the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, prioritizing weather forecasting and fisheries management in particular. We made sure that the Joint Polar Satellite System is funded, as well as the Geostationary Operational Environmental Satellite Series. We have, though, in order to live within our allocation, had to reduce funding in some other areas, eliminating those that no longer were necessary, those whose authorizations had expired, and, in fact, cut funding for more than a dozen bureaus and agencies that can operate with a little less. Let me also point out in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, that we have in this legislation extraordinarily important oversight language that requires each agency under our jurisdiction to submit a spending plan to the subcommittee. We have capped the life cycle costs for poorly performing programs, and we've also withheld some funding for the Department of Justice until the new Attorney General can demonstrate to us that the Inspector General's recommendations regarding sexual harassment and inappropriate conduct are being implemented. And I cannot stress that highly enough. When I met with the new Attorney General, that was one of the first things I brought to her attention. We've also required, Mr. Chairman, that agencies that purchase very sensitive information technology or telecommunications systems conduct a supply chain risk assessment in consultation with the FBI to be sure that there are no hardwired Trojan horses or back doors in that communication equipment or computer equipment being purchased by the federal government in those agencies under our jurisdiction. We're also requiring quarterly reporting on immigration judge performance and requiring agencies to provide inspector generals with timely information. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I want to point out that our legislation today continues Second Amendment protections that have been built into the bill before. We have withheld funding, for example, to make sure that the United Nations Arms Control Treaty, there's been some discussion about, is not funded. We have also prohibited the transfer or housing of Gitmo prisoners into the United States. But above all, the bottom line on this legislation is we want to ensure that the law as enacted by Congress is enforced If an agency wants to have access to our constituents' hard-earned tax dollars, Mr. Chairman, they're going to need to demonstrate that they're enforcing the law as written by Congress, not based on some memorandum or some internal document, but the law as written by Congress is fundamental to our entire system of government. Our liberty lies in the enforcement of law. It's the most fundamental principle of a republic. The nation, this great nation, was founded on that principle that no one is above the law, and the law shall be enforced equally and fairly to everybody with due process. And through our work on this subcommittee with the checks and balances that we have built into this legislation, the agencies under our jurisdiction are going to need to demonstrate that they're enforcing the law as written by Congress in order to entitle them to access to our taxpayers' very precious and hard-earned tax dollars. I'd reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you.